Another extraordinary FSA photographer is Gordon Parks, who is celebrated as a photographer not just for his work with FSA, but for work throughout his, and you can see 1912 to 2006, throughout his very, very long lifetime. He was a photographer, he was also a filmmaker, he produced the movie Shaft in 1971. He is also an extraordinary musician. He could compose classical music, yet he did not read music at all. He is simply an amazing photographer, writer, musician, filmmaker, and person. And he manages to do all of this without actually having a high school education. From the bar in the middle of this image where it reads Gordon Parks, A Choice of Weapons, you can also tell that he used the camera for purposes of exposing injustice and racism. And it was his choice of weapons. It was a way of literally revealing truth in an undeniable way to promote change, coming out of the tradition of social photography that was created by Hines in the earlier generation. Okay, this is on the right, Gordon Parks later in life. On the left, by one of his family members, it is Gordon Parks. I've shown you this one, with his lens as if to penetrate the world around him. He was completely self-taught in photography, but I think he was naturally gifted. And I would like to suggest that two tools for Gordon Parks are particularly important. One of them is depth of field, and the other is viewpoint. He was very, very good, and I think he had an intuition about how to use those tools in photography. The photo at the top left is Emerging Man. It was done in 1952. We're looking at these pictures just to get a flavor for the style of Gordon Parks. In this image, he is drawn from Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, which documents the plight of African Americans in a white society where they are simply not recognized. Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man, actually won the National Book Award in the 1950s, edging out Ernest Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea. So it's a pretty powerful document about the emotional and physical, literally physical isolation of African Americans in a white world. Gordon Parks knew Ellison and got together with him to create or stage the photograph that literally illustrates the storyline from Ellison's book. It's called, however, not Invisible Man, but Emerging Man, and what it shows is an African American male coming out of a manhole cover as if to suddenly appear and to take his rightful place in society. The image is a shot at the viewpoint of the man. I am imagining Gordon Parks down on the street in order to do this, and it also focuses only on the man. So he's using depth of field and viewpoint in a very powerful way to create a meaningful photograph. He does exactly the same thing in the work on the right. This is Malcolm X at a Chicago rally in the 1960s, I think 1963. Malcolm X is an individual who fought for social equality and justice. And Gordon Parks was given an assignment from Life magazine to cover the movement that Malcolm X was a part of, the Black Muslim movement in the United States. And Malcolm X allowed Gordon Parks to do that. Excuse me. We can see again the manipulation of viewpoint. Malcolm X is the inspirational leader, and so what Gordon Parks is doing is shooting up, looking at him. He's also manipulating depth of field, focusing really on the face of Malcolm X, spotlighted almost in a spiritual way, as if he's giving meaning to the group. I've also included lower left a photograph of Gordon Parks. At the time, he was documenting the Black Muslim movement in Chicago. The reason I like the photo is he's wearing a suit and he's down on the floor. Why is he down on the floor? He's down on the floor so he can get the viewpoint that he thinks is necessary to make a meaningful image. Just as a reminder, we saw this earlier. The work that's on the left is a Gordon Parks. It too was taken in the 1960s in Chicago as a reflection of the documentation of the Black Muslim movement. This is Ethel, I think it's Ethel Sharp, who was the leader of the Black Muslim women, and we talked about this in a number of different ways, including repetition being used to create rhythm. But before we go there, I want to suggest again viewpoint and depth of field. Okay, with depth of field, he's made her the leader, the clear leader. She's the only one in focus. The ladies following her are blurred, and the suggestion is they are whispers in the choir where she is the full voice. She's leading them, she's making the statements for them. We're in this case looking just a tiny bit down at her. That's not to say she's vulnerable, because I think this lady is a formidable force. But what it does is to suggest the continuation of the group, the numbers in the group, and it really becomes a panoramic document of the figures in that group and its large scale. Okay, now returning to the repetition here of the figures similarly clad, it does create a sense of rhythm. Rhythm helps to create unity and energy. And that is something that Gordon Parks is going to do in our next photograph when he documents the success of Leonard Bernstein. Gordon Parks was not a stranger to celebrity photography, and he knew how to satisfy the ego of his subjects. That includes Leonard Bernstein, who was a pretty impressive composer working in New York City. This is Leonard Bernstein at the age of 36, embarking on a superstar career. And what Gordon Parks has done to suggest this is to place him in one of his own theaters or auditoriums, illuminated from behind. The repetition of the lights create a ring around him, almost as if it is vibrating in a halo shape to suggest his fame and his glory. He also has a score sheet underneath his arm, and fashionable in the 1950s, he's holding a cigarette, which was considered to be cool and I guess also sexy. Gordon Parks, having placed us a little bit underneath Lenny to look up at him, has created a successful image of a man who has made excuse me, who has made his mark on 20th century society. Both of these photographs, in fact, are of individuals who were workers, but they are of different types of workers. The one on the left is a white male worker. The one that's located on our right is a black female worker. This is entitled American Gothic. The figure number in our book is 9.1. And this is probably Gordon Parks' most famous image. It was created very shortly after he joined FSA. Stryker, who was again in charge of the photographers of FSA, saw some of Gordon Parks' photographs and invites him to join them on a fellowship. He gets Gordon Parks to come to Washington, D.C., which is where FSA is located, and he gives him the assignment of documenting poverty and discrimination in the city of Washington, D.C. This photograph was taken in 1942. The first thing that Stryker did was to send Gordon Parks out into Washington to get to know the city. He said, go to a movie, go shopping, see what the city itself is like. Well, in 1942, it was a highly prejudiced city, and Gordon Parks did not have a very good experience. When he came back to the FSA building, which is a government building, he runs into this lady. Her name is Ella Watson, and she's the cleaning woman. She mopped the floors essentially for the FSA. And I think at this point, Gordon Parks is just a tiny bit ticked off. And he strikes up a conversation with Ella and creates an iconic image of the plight of African American workers in a white world. He shows her to us, not from below, but we're looking at her eye level. And I do think the reason for that is to make this an incredibly open composition so she can look directly at us and raise questions about her situation. This photograph, I think you can tell, is a staged photograph. It's a very posed photograph. It is a symmetrical, formal, and frontal photograph as well, which elevates it in seriousness. In comparison to Ella, the flag behind her seems to be very large in scale. The flag, of course, is not normally displayed in this fashion. It normally flies in a horizontal position. It's now in a vertical position, sometimes used as an indication of distress for the nation or for the party that is flying the flag irregularly. In this case, however, I think what Gordon Parks is doing is using the stripes of the flag to suggest the bars which lock Ella Watson into the position that she has as a charwoman, as someone who sweeps and mops the floors. The flag also is a little bit blurry, so Gordon Parks is using depth of field again, and he's using viewpoint selectively to enhance the power of the picture. Ella Watson would have, in 1942, have had two handicaps in acquiring a decent paying job. The first of them would be that she is a woman, and the second of them would be that she is an African American or a black woman. Both of those strikes would have meant essentially she was trapped in a meaningful job with no future and low wages. And I do think that that is conveyed in the stripes of the flag behind Ella Watson. Okay. When Gordon Parks printed this picture and showed it to Roy Stryker, he looked at it, I'm going to say thoughtfully, recognized that it was a good picture, which it is, and it's since been kind of an iconic image in the creations of Gordon Parks. But this is more or less what Stryker said to Gordon Parks, quote, "Well, you're catching on, but this picture could get us all fired." The photograph, in fact, was actually deep-sixed. It was censored until the 1970s, so it never saw the light of day. And the reason for that is the photograph very clearly condemns the U.S. government. It is the government char worker. It is the government woman who's cleaning the floors, who's locked into this position. And it became a condemnation upon the actual organization, the FSA, that was trying to help people in this period. Gordon Parks himself said the first time he actually saw the photo, because remember, FSA photos are owned by the government, not by the photographer, and they locked it away. They censored it until the 70s. Was one time he was flying on a plane, and he happened to pull out the magazine that the airlines produce, and in these magazines there are stories, and there was a story that incorporated this particular photo. So it was buried for decades until it was considered a photograph that could be shown in public. The title of this photograph is drawn from a painting which was produced about the same time period by an artist whose name is Grant Wood, and it is called American Gothic, and I'm pretty sure you have all seen it. Grant Wood's picture, which is shown on the right, shows two rather stoic and apparently hard-working people. It's referred to as American Gothic because the window in the building that unifies them is in the shape of a Gothic arch. The message of the painting basically is, if you work hard in America, you will succeed. By naming the Ella Watson photo American Gothic, it implies the paradox that occurs, the irony that occurs if you are in fact a female, or a black female in particular, working very hard in the United States, but at the same time you're limited. It's more than a glass ceiling. It's actually a prison that kind of locks you into your position so that there's no real hope for your future. Gordon Parks will go on and do a photo essay on Ella Watson, who actually becomes a friend and one of his I'm going to say iconic subjects that he produced over his career as a photographer.